So, Habib, this is a topic now that I'm opening up that is very much linked to what we were saying before about education, right? So, for many people who were raised and are practicing good Muslims with much modesty, when they get into a marriage, they frankly just don't know what to do. Like they are very awkward. They don't know how to approach their spouse. And this is both men and women from very simple things, because again, it's only like a few scenes they've seen maybe on TV or something, but they don't actually know how to approach their partner or to touch their partner in a way that is attractive and appealing rather than awkward and weird. How do we mitigate this issue? Because, of course, we want everyone to stay righteous and practicing. You know, this is what we promote here. So, what is the solution for that?
Education, education, education. And I want to start off with education because if someone is, as you put it, very practicing and very modest, it doesn't mean that one cannot educate themselves about intimate matters. And again, especially within our tradition, you have a plethora of books written by righteous, educated scholars speaking about intimacy, how one should approach their wife um, on the first night, speaking about women's right to intimacy, to satisfaction. And it's important to know this. Again, this is within our tradition. So again, I think sometimes when people use the term practicing or righteous, it's as if that one can't be sensual or erotic when that's also part and parcel of our humanity. Now, again, as long as one exercises it within a lawful means, that's absolutely fine. If anything is praiseworthy. Now, even prior to being married, one is still sensual, one is still erotic because you still have experiences, whether it's in the form of ihtilam, like an erotic dream and what have you, that you're still going to be educated in terms of how to purify yourself for prayer. So it's not like you're asexual and then as soon as you're married, you become sexual or erotic or sensual. And I think this is also a problem that in many of our communities, many of us are very uncomfortable to have this conversation prior to marriage. So that's why when people get into marriages, these things have become very awkward because they don't know how to communicate with themselves. They don't know about their body. They don't know even. I mean, I have some, questions where newly married couples will ask, "What part of my body part can my husband enter?" And it's just like, and it's not. And these are women that are over 20, some in their 30s, men who are ask a lot of questions about premature ejaculation and things like that because they haven't had this conversation prior to marriage. And again, I just think this is where we have, and I'm saying we collectively as a community have done a disservice to people because we infantilize. Again, I'm speaking, and as long as someone's over the age of, let me just say 18 for these purposes, then they should be educated on such matters. And women also need to feel and to realize that they're entitled to pleasure. Now, if you're raised in a society where you have been told that intimacy is just purely for the man and you're just supposed to be there just to help him experience pleasure, then I would argue that you've been miseducated. That's not what the religion teaches. That's why I wrote my book, A Taste of Honey, and I'm doing some of the works I'm doing. But I still know that for some Muslims, or for a lot of Muslims, there's a big disconnect where if I were to write about, or when I wrote about or speak about intimacy from an Islamic perspective, a lot of Muslim practicing, shall we say, find that very uncomfortable. When I or someone speaks about intimacy from a non-religious perspective, those same Muslims are very comfortable to read it.
Hmm. So
So I'm
they
asking
don't
them,
like
okay,
the word religion next to sexuality, and that needs to
they don't
change,
like religion next
right?
to sexuality, they don't like intimacy next to Islam. They don't like so then my question is, why have you separated intimacy, sexuality from religion and Islam?
Yes. Yeah,
Why is
I
it
mean,
you
I remember if I think back to a friend and she was newly married and she's very religious. I remember her disclosing that she almost felt uncomfortable, like she had this very austere type of a lifestyle. And now that she's married and she's doing these things, that there was some kind of like a moral dilemma that she was experiencing, the schism, you know?
yeah, so that's why for me I would question, not to say that the person isn't religious, not to say the person isn't sincere, but I would argue that their interpretation of religion or their interpretation of what it means to be righteous, it contradicts what a lot of the early Muslims, their understanding. That's what I would say. So again, I'm not saying the person's not religious. I'm not questioning their faith. I'm just questioning their understanding of what it means to be religious and their religiosity. Is it in alignment with what the Prophet peace be upon him taught and how it was understood by the first Muslims? Because they didn't have these grievances.
So Habib,
They
I mean,
didn't
this
have.
is a this is
Yeah.
now a theoretical thing, education, but in the
Sure.
nitty gritty, as in, like, let me ask you this: do you think that not sexuality, but can sensuality be learnt, or is it something that you either have it or you don't? Like you can either dance or you can't dance. Some people just have rhythm, and some people just don't. So, do you think that sensuality is something that can actually be acquired?
Of course, 100% sensuality can be acquired because it can be very, so for example, there are some people who may have experienced sexual trauma. They might have a disconnect between their mind and their body. They might feel their body has betrayed them, that they don't want to enjoy that pleasures that their body is showing. And that's very common. This is like a concept even of people that struggle with arousal non-concordance, where their body is responding one way, but their mind is saying something totally different. So that is that happens for both men and women alike. It can happen for various reasons. And those who maybe feel that they're not somewhat sensual, they can develop sensuality. They can develop the feelings, the emotions to embrace those sensations. And I don't think anything is wrong with that. But if again, if you've been shamed from a relatively young age, or if you've been taught that like I know of people, and these are non-Muslims, and actually she's a Muslim, one in particular. She was very sensual, sexual, shall we put it, prior to being married. Then when she got married, her husband shamed her so much that she then lost her sensuality, that she lost herself. So this can happen both ways, where she felt that how can I now be sensual because he's told me or has molded me to be, if I'm going to be this good wife, I can't be expressive in the bedroom. And then again, it was for her to deconstruct this understanding of what it means to be a good wife was formed by him, which wasn't in alignment with her, which wasn't in alignment with her beliefs. I mean, she was a Christian, but I'm saying so. This is also a problem that if you've been taught that to be a good wife or to be sensual, that equates to you being promiscuous, that is a problem. So again, it's these limiting beliefs or these misbeliefs or these misunderstandings. But in terms of sorry, in response to your question, yeah, I do believe one can learn to be sensual. You can be someone who is not very sensual at one point in your time for different reasons, but you can learn to be in tune with your body. And also, again, a lot of it starts in the mind. A lot of the stuff, whether we're talking about sensuality, whether we're talking about climax, intimacy, the greatest relationship or the most important relationship that one has is with themselves. That's what many psychologists and sexologists start with. And then it's with their partner. So if you feel that intimacy is just for your partner, and especially if you're having an issue with your partner, anything that even you having enjoyment, you're not gonna have any enjoyment. That's why again, I think one needs to just first understand what does it mean to be sensual. Again, if you're looking from a religious perspective, how was sensuality understood from the righteous forebearers in terms of the Prophet peace be upon him and the companions? That's the example I always like to go with, not with. And the reason why I use the Prophet and the early companions because I think all of us can agree that they are the best of people. The Prophet, of course, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and after him the companions. You have some religious interpretations, later move other movements who are against sensuality. Some like Imam Ghazali spoke about it when he wrote Ihya that there's some Sufis they abstain from marriage. So, for example, or they looked at marriage it's just there to procreate. It's just there to fulfill a need. And a lot of um, not only Sufis, but a lot of the Muslim scholars who bought into that idea, a lot of them were influenced by Christian understandings of asceticism. Now, there are some Muslims who still have that understanding. So that's why, again, I'm not looking at those as example. I'm looking at the best of people, which are the Prophet and the companions. They didn't have that understanding. Sensuality was part of spirituality. It wasn't devoid of one another. So that's why I think for a number of people, you might need to unlearn some of what it means to be religious, to be righteous, to be modest. Because some people they believe that because of their modesty, they can't ask any questions because of they're so shy and being shy is a praiseworthy virtue and it's wonderful. But if you have excessive shyness to the point where you can't seek knowledge, you can't ask questions, that's now blameworthy. That's not commendable. So this is why again, when we're speaking about shyness, shyness and modesty is not the same as being prudish. It's not the same as prudery. So it's just about having an understanding that when we're talking about what does it mean to be shy, what does it mean to be demure? What does it mean to be, um, righteous? Is that in alignment with what the Prophet, peace be upon him, taught and how it was understood by the first community? Again, I always want to emphasize that community, not later generations, because I can give you books and examples of scholars who, when they speak about intimacy, it's very much similar to what Christians have, certain Catholics have said, where it's just for procreation purposes. You shouldn't speak in the bedroom. One shouldn't look at one's private parts. It's all very much just very mechanical. Now, that's an understanding that I personally don't subscribe to or agree with. But if that's something that one has bought into, then they can feel a lot of shame and guilt if they're now married and, if being sensual because they believe they're not supposed to partake in that because that's dunyawi, that's of the world. Then my argument is that that wasn't the understanding of the companion. So which one do you want to follow? So that's why again it's about understanding, or, unlearning some of one's belief systems in terms of what it means to be very practicing and modest. Because when one educates themselves and you're comfortable in your own skin, you'll realize that you can be very sensual and you can learn to be sensual. There are many books that talk about that.
Okay, now, Habib, for people who are seeking to get married and they have a prospective person, should they broach the topic of sexual intimacy? And also, this is now a person who has not been married before, and then also people who have been married before. How would that discussion differ? And what is the elegant and dignified way of doing that? Should there be another person, like a mediator involved? And then sorry, I want to add to that. Cultural expectations are also so important. I know of somebody and her husband is from Southeast Asia, very conservative culture, very asexual background, and she happens to be Arab and she comes from a very sensual culture. And all these expectations going into marriage, not having any clue, because of course, how could we possibly talk about that? These are two people who were not married before, and it's caused an immense strain on the marriage. So,
Yeah, I definitely believe that one should have these conversations prior to marriage. Again, I don't believe in infantilizing um, people, treating people like they're children, because people are aware of intimate matters. Even if they've not had an actual physical relationships, many people are aware of it, but many of us pretend like we're not aware of it. And again, because a lot of cultural expectations and pressures. And there are some fair questions that one needs to ask, whether it's about one's history, especially sexual history in terms of like STIs and things like that. I think that's a fair question. One's expectations in terms of um, certain acts that is also permissible or in a grey area, like oral stimulation and things like that. What do they feel about those type of things? Even having the conversations around consent, I think it's a very important point. And this is something that is often not spoken about in many religious circles because if you read many classical books of fiqh and medieval Islamic literature, it doesn't speak about consent as much as one would like. So you have some brothers who have some understandings that, and also some misinterpretation of certain hadiths that they believe that a wife doesn't have the right to say no in the bedroom. So if you have a brother that has this understanding, and of course the woman has an understanding that she has the right to consent, and he's not allowed to force himself upon his wife, that's a big issue that a lot of Muslims don't talk about. But the brothers coming from perspective that that's my right, that's my haq. I'm allowed to force myself upon my wife. Now, again, I completely disagree with that. Of course, consent should be part of an Islamic marriage and an Islamic relationship. But if we're honest, that is a big issue, like the whole topic of like marital rape or coercion in marriage. So this is why even having that conversation, like the wife or the woman asking the potential husband, like what what is his views about consent? How does he understand the hadith of angels cursing the wife and things like that? See his mindset. Because some brothers, I'll be honest, and I've dealt with this or have this a very I'm gonna be careful with my language, but behave like beasts, if I'm honest with you. So not just in terms of like expectation in the bedroom, but how does he view women or his wife? Is she just there to purely satisfy his desires, even if she doesn't want to? Because a number of brothers do have that mentality, unfortunately. And a lot of it is because they haven't been educated about relationships, about women, about consent, about such matters. So yes, in terms of the first part of your question, I definitely believe it's important to have these open and honest conversations about intimacy and trying to understand one's expectations. And again, you can do this in a manner which is in a dignified way. You don't need to be crude. You
Do
know,
you think,
you're speaking to an adult.
yeah,
Sorry, go
do
on.
you think what do you call it, like a mediator, like an aunt or somebody to get involved? It might be kind of weird to have someone's dad
Yeah,
or brother there, but you know,
exactly. Yeah,
like an older woman or something.
yeah.
But
Again, so in terms of
I'm saying this because you know these Muslim dating apps are
yeah, again,
horrendous,
this
and
one.
I've seen people complain where they say, "Wow, you know, this guy straight up asked me, what are you willing to do in bed?" And he's such a perv and stuff. And it's true, like the way that he asked was completely ridiculous and outrageous.
Yeah, but
So
this is again, this is someone brothers who behave like that or men who behave like that acts. Like that is someone that even the way someone being very forthright and asking such a question, you can see tell that someone who doesn't know how to communicate with women. That's just obvious. It's like there's a way of speaking about or asking or trying to receive information, but to be very direct and say it within, a few settings in terms of like a meeting or via text. Again, that shows that reflects a person's character. So it's not a case of that information that he's seeking or that the woman's seeking, one cannot receive that. But it's again the way you ask that information, and also some of the information or some of the do you actually necessarily need to know that? One's past in terms of if they have an STI and stuff, that's I think completely valid. Or if one has any sexual issues, whether it's premature ejaculation, not erectile dysfunction, I think that's a valid question. Whether one has had any issues with porn consumption, because number of people get into marriages and they wasn't aware that the husband has been addicted to porn for a number of years. That's a fair question that I think a woman has every right to know. Whether the husband has any intention to take a second or third wife, I think that's a valid question. So all of these are valid and perfectly acceptable questions. Is how you go about it. Again, whether you want to use a mediator, whether you want to use like I said, a family, whether you want to write about, or you can do it in a way, a subtle way where you have a number of like a list of questions or points that are like non-negotiables, and you can include some of these points. The person doesn't have to act to answer directly. So
that's
you
a
could
great
like you
idea.
can
You can, yeah, give him
yeah
a multiple choice
most
questionnaire. Select all that apply. What are you willing to do? What are you not willing to
not even
do?
necessarily like that. You could just have it like just say like five. These are my
Okay.
non-negotiables, and one of them could be someone who is addicted to porn, someone who has an STI. So some of these things, so he doesn't necessarily, even if so when he or she is aware of okay, these are non-negotiables, they've got when they say okay, I can't because that's an issue, that's non-negotiable, then I don't fit you, then he doesn't need to tell you it was because of this. It's because I'm addicted to porn. It's because I've got an STI. Do you understand? So, but I think it's very important to have but to communicate that before it's too late, before one gets married. But at the same time, I'm not speaking about the brothers who are sending crude or lewd messages via dating apps. That's someone again that's it's immaturity. Like you have people who know how to communicate because again, and I'm assuming that most of the people that are communicating, whether you want to call it dating or situationships or courting, they know how to communicate with the opposite sex when they're at work. They know how to be professional. They know how to conduct themselves. But for whatever reason, when it comes into like a religious sphere of seeking marriage, then all of a sudden people act like, oh my God, I don't know how to communicate. And I'm saying that's a problem. Like sometimes we create this I don't know, it's just very strange and it's also it's unnatural because if you're maybe at work or you're speaking to someone opposite sex or you're wherever, you'll kind of get an idea in terms of if you're particularly interested or in someone, what have you, but you don't need to let everyone know. Obviously, when you have like a very formal setting, it's very difficult because both parties kind of know what they're there for. So obviously, it's like an interview, and generally, you can't really have people on their best behavior. So it's also very difficult to know one's like personality. But in terms of like the non-negotiables or things like the attitudes towards consent, the attitudes towards like expectations in the bedroom, I think that's important to ask. Things which I don't think is one needs to ask, like brothers will ask me about body parts. Should I ask? I don't think those type of things you need to ask. And I think there are things that you don't need to ask. Likewise, if a woman's asking about genital size, and I don't think one needs to ask that. If it's a really big problem, like the person has got a an issue, fair enough. But in terms of um the size, that's immature conversations and immature information that you don't really need to know. But that's also because maybe they think that that is linked to how good the person is in the bedroom. But it's really about mindset. I think what's more important is compatibility, sexual compatibility, and the reason how one can understand that, like when you alluded to like the Arab lady marrying the brother from Southeast Asia, it's like compatibility. So certain things that she might think that's appropriate or inappropriate that he might, and again that's compatibility and their expectations. So even there are some brothers who think that a woman initiating intimacy is completely unacceptable. I'm not going to say haram, they just think it's unacceptable. Now, if that's his understanding, that's his expectation, he's well within his right and he doesn't want a wife who would initiate intimacy or even talk about it. Now, if that's the case and that's what his requirement, then the woman knows that if she feels comfortable to initiate intimacy or talk about intimate matters with her husband, but he doesn't want that, then they're not compatible. End of. It's not about changing someone, it's just understanding what are your non-negotiables, what are things that maybe we're compatible on, and what are things that maybe we can work on. This is why it's important that women are aware of who the person they're getting married to, because there are a number of brothers, religious brothers, bearded, praise, all the rest of it, maybe have memorized the Quran, they have these perverse views that women are just there to procreate. Outside of that, in terms of intimacy, romance, love languages, I'm not interested. And it's important that women are aware of that. So if a woman is going into a marriage and thinking, oh, because he's memorized the Quran, because he's religious, they equate religiosity with good character, with good husband, that's a problem. Because even when the Prophet, peace be upon him, has said that if a man comes to propose to one of like your daughter and he's got good character in religion, then marry him off. The Prophet distinguished religion and good character. They're not the same. Unfortunately, for many of us, because we find even having these conversations um difficult, sometimes we get into relationship like marriages, and then I don't say it's too late, but it can be too late. So that's why you're protecting yourself by finding out and trying to understand what is his mindset about women. It's very important, like because I could go on, but some of the some um I wish, because I'm always wondering where do they get this from. But again, if you've had a very sheltered life away from women, and again, it doesn't have to be physical relationships where you see women are just pure fitna, I can't interact with them, blah, 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 blah. You can have very warped ideas about women and intimacy. So, especially again, you've not had any relationship, then you get married, and then all of a sudden she's just there to be to fulfill your desires or to be your servant. It's just, and this is also a problem why we have many like unhealthy intimate relationships, because of many of us have like warped ideas about intimacy and what women's like role is in the bedroom.
Mhm. Habib, there are men and women out there who really struggle to guard their chastity who are not married. And some of them might have years of celibacy. And as we know, statistically speaking, many of these people will actually never marry. Do you have any advice on how people, Muslims, can manage this?
I would say first and foremost, obviously the fear of Allah, to have taqwa of Allah. That's most important. And number two, we often hear that sex is an act of worship in Islam, but also not having sex can also be an act of worship in Islam. And what I mean by that, as in one abstaining can be an act of worship. As in, if one is abstaining from intimate relations because they want to seek the pleasure of Allah, because they want to do things like in the right way until they get married, or if they do get married, then inshallah Allah's rewarded them for that as well. Because we hear the hadiths again or the commentary that sex is an act of worship, but also not engaging like this the story of Prophet Yusuf in the Quran refusing to have intimate relations with a beautiful woman that he was attracted to, but abstaining, seeking the pleasure of Allah, that's an act of worship. That's something that he's going to be rewarded by. Hadith that the Prophet spoke about a man who is attracted or enticed by a woman, a beautiful woman, who wants to commit fornication with him and he refuses out of fear of Allah. That's an act of worship which you're going to be rewarded by. So I just think that again, it's our mindset in terms of how we view intimacy. And again, especially as Muslims, everything we're doing, we're trying to do things for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if one is not married and one is obviously trying to refrain from intimacy. I don't like to use the word celibate because there's more Christian connotations, and I like to use like preserving one's chastity or their private parts. That's also an act of, because it's an active act that inshallah you're going to get rewarded for it. I'm just trying to think that again, and again as Muslims, whichever situation you're in, whether you're in a good situation and you're praising like you're in a blessing and you're praising Allah, you're going to get rewarded for it. If you're in a difficult situation, like you're in a tribulation, but you're patient, you're also going to get rewarded for it. So I'm not going to say that, oh, if you, because they do this in my country of origin, I'm not to put them on blast, but some unscrupulous people, they'll say, oh, if you just recite this dua, then Allah will bless you. I don't like to give fairy tales and stuff like that. I don't like to say things like that because that's not true. But not to lose hope in love, that inshallah you will find someone. But in the meantime, on your journey, go easy on yourself because I think sometimes, because for many people, I think for women more than men, I often hear women define themselves based on being a mother or being a wife, and I think that's problematic. Whilst, of course, in our tradition, Islam puts a great emphasis on motherhood and being a good wife. That's not what defines you. That's not where your value lies. And I think, again, like I said, because amongst men, when men get together, generally speaking, that's not what we identify. That you don't put that first until what that defines you. But I often hear that more from women. I'm always somewhat wondering like why is it that so much emphasis is placed on being a mother or being a wife? Because if you have someone in that circle who's not a wife or is not a mother, they might feel like they can't contribute or they're less valued. And I just think that's also problematic when we push that so much in our religious circles. Because there are many examples, and I like to use example in from the Quran and I actually got a lot of flack when I posted this, and I don't know why. Um in Surah Al-Tahrim, the 66th chapter of the Quran, where I'm just paraphrasing what Allah mentioned two women as examples for believers, not just for women, but for men and women. One of the person or one of the women he used as an example was a single mother who wasn't married, and the other was a childless woman who was in an abusive relationship. Obviously, the first example is Maryam, the mother of Jesus, the daughter of Imran. And obviously, the second lady is Asiya, the wife of Fir'aun. Now, when you reflect on that chapter of the Quran, that surah, when you reflect on the last three verses, when Allah speaks about Maryam and Asiya, Allah doesn't praise them for being a mother, for being a wife. It's because of their iman. It's because of their chastity. It's because Maryam was safeguarding her chastity. So, and again, it's not to knock motherhood or being a wife. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that you should learn from that is the most important thing is your faith, and everyone's going to be put in a trial or a test, and what Allah says is how you react to that. Now, for some people, motherhood is a blessing. For other people, being a wife is a blessing. For other people, being single is a blessing. But I think to put all of the emphasis on your value as a Muslim woman, as a righteous woman, is being a wife or a mother, I think that's problematic. Because that's not from our tradition. Because if you read the Quran, it's very clear. So I just think that for those who are again who are single, whilst again, yes, if you want to, if that's what you're seeking, you should try and obviously find partner, inshallah, Allah will provide. But in the meantime, that shouldn't consume you. And I think you should have to maybe look at the way you view what it means to be a woman or righteous person. It's not just to be a mother, or it's not just to
Right.
be
But you're focusing
um
on identity, the
yeah,
conception, the perception. I'm talking about like the physical struggle that people go through.
the physical struggle.
Yes.
Okay, so this might be controversial, but there's some scholars who did have no issue with women self-pleasuring. And I know some people might be horrified by that, but this is within our tradition. There are many scholars like Ibn Aqil, who was a scholar from the 11th or 12th century, Hanbali scholar. He said that there were a number of women who were unmarried and they had no issue with women relieving themselves to relieve sexual urges. Likewise, there was many scholars of the past, like Mujahid, who said, or Al Hassan al Basri said something similar. The scholar from the Salaf, from the first three generations. So again, I know for this is a topic, and again, some people will find this completely. inappropriate and they'll be completely offended by this. But this is within our tradition. So I don't know why some people are offended by something that's within our tradition and it's something that has helped some people. If it's something that one is not comfortable with, by all means, you don't have to do it. And I'm not saying that this is something that one has to do. And some people find it completely helpful and beneficial. So that's also a way of helping someone from committing fornication or adultery, and even to get to know themselves. So again, I don't have no issue with that. But I know some people, again, especially in some cultures, it's more they have more of an issue with it more than others. But that's a practical way. And again, when I've mentioned this or I talk about this, oftentimes people will say, "Oh, you're speaking about you're encouraging pornography," and I said, "Where did I say pornography?" Because I know in many cases, especially with men, self-pleasure is linked to pornography, but I'm not speaking about pornography. I'm just talking about, as you was alluding to, you're asking someone who is struggling with their desires in a physical way, what can they do? That's one option. I'm not going to say, "I'll have a secret boyfriend or go and get a secret lover." I'm not. That's not permissible means, but self-pleasure, according to some scholars, that's a permissible means. And obviously, one could also say fasting as well. But I'm sure many people have exhausted that, and that's not the only way out, so to speak. So that's just two. Obviously, like fasting, self pleasure, obviously making constant dua and stuff like that. But and also distracting yourself, and also I think one and to realize that even if one slips, shall we say, or falls or gets himself into situationship, um, to know that there's still hope. You can turn back to Allah Subhanahu wa Taala because, and we do not have this obsession that okay, because one might have indulged or what have you, it doesn't mean that you can't turn back to Allah Subhanahu wa Taala because we're human beings and Allah knows us more than we know ourselves. We are going to make mistakes, and I find that sometimes when people talk about or to people who are single because they're speaking from a place of privilege because maybe like they're married, they don't know the realities that people are going through. So it's very easy to say just pray and Allah, if you've been like married for like 15, 20 years, and you've been married since you was like, I don't know, 20 years old, and now you're like your 40s, you don't know what people are going through, especially if someone's been divorced for like a number of years. So just having that level of empathy and realizing that sometimes you don't have the answers or there's no solution, so to speak, but to have a level of empathy and realize that, okay, whatever you're going through, do not lose hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and go easy on yourself and take it day by day because again, I don't like to give quick fixes or say if you do this, then this is going to solve your problems, and then you won't have any of these cravings and stuff, such and such. Because I think that would just be completely disingenuous, and Allah knows best.
Thank
I'm
you.
sorry if I'm going to get heat for that, but I just think that I needed to say that because sometimes people like to tiptoe
Well,
around,
I mean,
like
several people
being a bit
asked me to ask you that question. So,
really, yeah. Again, because
because the struggle is
I
real.
yeah, no, the
Yeah.
struggles, and the reason why maybe I did post about it recently on my page, and the reason why maybe I should have, and some people did message me, appreciate it. I did a summary, and I'm quoting classical scholars. It's not just me because people were thinking, who's this degenerate from the UK talking about self-pleasure in Islam? And I'm like, no, I'm quoting competent, qualified scholars from as back as the companions, the Tabi'in, Ibn Hazm, Ibn Aqil. There's many scholars, Ash-Shawkani, who wrote a book on the permissibility of masturbation, both men and women alike. This is not a new phenomenon. Like this is something that we have to be honest with ourselves. The reality is that there are a lot of people that's going to get married, and there are a lot of people that are not going to get married, and there are a lot of people that, and again, especially if you're speaking to people who have been married and now they're no longer married, to act like as if they don't know what intimacy and pleasure tastes like, you're just lying to yourself. And this is something that many of the scholars they addressed and they spoke about that people had these concerns, both men and women alike. So again, for me personally, it's not a taboo topic, but I know for a number of Muslims, it's a very taboo topic. But the whole idea of me with some of the work I'm doing is trying to show that we have precedent in our tradition. Because maybe one scholar or some scholars find this very uncomfortable to talk about, many of the scholars of the past, spoke about this at great length. The disadvantage for many Muslims in the world nowadays is because they don't have access to these books in Arabic. That's why they're unaware of it. And many of the Islamic preachers, teachers, imams, they know of this, but they're just not telling people this. So they'll kind of like again infantilize women or make. And I believe you. I mean, the honest truth is, but when they're talking to the brothers, they're telling brothers that this isn't an option.
Mm.
Or they'll tell a brother, which again I think is completely unethical. You can go and take a secret wife, even if she's non-Muslim, but she's Christian, to satisfy your desires. And that's completely unethical. So that's something that unfortunately, but in terms of what is a practical, legitimate, according to many scholars, outlet, in terms of like self-pleasure, they find that, oh, we can't talk about that, even though many of the scholars of the past, great scholars, if they spoke about this and this has happened hundreds of years ago and they didn't have much of an issue with it, why do we have so much issue with it? And again, I would argue it's because many of us have become quite puritanical when speaking about intimacy, especially when it pertains to women, because I'm telling you, when it pertains to men, many of those same, religious figures have no issue kind of giving the advice to the men to telling the brothers, okay, this is fine for you to do.
Mhm. Thank you.
And obviously, Allah knows best.
Habib, thank you so much for your time. You really had said so much that left us with so much to think about. So thank you so much. And also, I will encourage everyone to get hold of Habib's books, and I'll be linking that information afterwards. And anything you'd like to say in closing?
Yeah, I'd just like to thank you for inviting me, Sumaya. Jazakallah khairan, and may Allah reward you for your endeavors. And just to encourage people to learn, to not be afraid to empower yourself with knowledge, to educate yourself, to read books, and to develop some critical thinking skills, and to know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with you. And again, just to realize that our tradition is vast. So I just think that it's important that one doesn't lose hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not to lose hope in love, inshallah.
Thank you so much. Wishing you all the best. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.